what I really want to advocate is that we want to explain those emotions and tie them to something that is more kind of in your head. Like, what is it that the designer have done that causes you to have certain types of emotions? Okay, so having looked at, hundreds and hundreds of work, and including all the works that I decided not to write about, so probably thousands of works over 10 years, I have noticed that there's certain bad habits that designers often have. And there are 11 of them that I want to point out here. And I promise that I will be better than your typical nutrition scientist. So if I tell you fat is bad, I won't come back next year to tell you fat is good. So here are 11 bad habits that I will still tell you are bad habits if you keep doing it. The first one is you pick your tool before you pick your design. So that happens quite a bit. Like, people would say, I am a ggplot2 person. I am an Excel person. I'm a Tableau person. And the problem with doing this sort of thing is that each tool has its own strengths and weaknesses. And in a sort of insidious way, you will find that your vision is going to be very limited by the tool set that you have. So you may not think about it consciously. You might not think you've been constrained. But over time, you basically are only going to think about chart forms and things that you could do easily with the tool that you want. And I've always been of the idea that in the design phase, I'm not even thinking about any tools. I'm just making my design. And then after that, I try to figure out which of the tools that I know will get me to that design more easily. Secondly, I find that people often pick the design before they pick the question. So an example of this is this very famous chart, also viral. This was in Wired. This supposedly illustrated one day, 24 hours worth of 311 calls in New York City. So it's part of the Open Data Project, and the different color bands are illustrating different categories of calls. It's like, no matter how much time I've stared at this, I keep asking myself, what was the reason for this chart to exist? What is the designer trying to tell me here? Because I do get some insights from here. I know that when people are sleeping, they're not calling 311. I also know that if you're going to call about noise, you probably are calling in the wee hours of the morning. The pink band is telling me that. But there's very little other things of interest here that I could find. And then really, if you think about what you want to do with this data set, and some of my former students have actually done some work with this data set, is that you can do a much nicer, more interesting project by, for instance, just tackling one type of complaints. So let's say if you want to tackle just streetlights complaints, you can go out there and just subset it to the streetlights, and you can build a whole story around streetlight complaints, which would be a lot more informative, for instance, than this one that has all of the data, but really no real question. I've talked about this before, but in my own kind of way of conceptualizing and thinking about critique, I have this triangular framework that I use. So I think about three things. I think about what is the question. This is the most important one. I think about what is the question that the chart is supposed to address. And under that, you should think about what's the message that the chart is supposed to convey, what's the insights that it's supposed to show. Then I think about what is the data telling me about that question. So the green arrow here is also talking about the harmony between the different corners. So you want the data to actually address your question. So one of the problems that are out there is that the data might actually be okay, but it's not actually answering that question. You just found a data set that's related, but not quite there. sometimes the data is saying something different because the data is bad, or it has holes, or it has problems with it, or you need to adjust for bias, or you need to adjust for the population, or for inflation, or all kinds of other things. So there's a lot of important things that you need to do with the data in order to make a visualization work. And then the last thing is, what is the visual saying? So this also have to be in harmony with the other two parts. The visual have to highlight an answer to the question that you have posed. And also the visual should be appropriate to the types of data that you're plotting. So traditionally, most of the attention in our field is on that V corner, right? This is where you choose your chart form, you choose your colors, you choose the thickness of your lines, where you place your text labels and your legends and so on, and that all falls into visual. But what I've been finding as I kind of write about a lot of this stuff is oftentimes, even if your visual is done perfectly, your chart could still not work. And usually it's because there's no real question you're trying to address, so it's a mishmash of a lot of things. Or it is that there's something about your data that is not actually properly transformed, or not actually cleaned up properly, or it is just not even relevant to the question. And that kind of causes a lot of projects to fail. So the third bad habit is when you think like a designer, not like a reader. So you find that almost every piece that I write on my site is written from the perspective of somebody reading the work. Like, what are they perceiving? What are they looking at first? What is jumping out, and all of that. I'll give you an example of this. So this showed up in the Wall Street Journal last year. I'm pretty sure that the person is thinking about design and not thinking about the reader here. Because I see potentially a backdrop of Manhattan, and maybe some mountains or something, and then I see these numbers that make no sense in terms of where they sit on the page. There are lots and lots of issues here if you look at it carefully. But from a design perspective, it looks pretty nice. I can also never figure out the stuff between 366 and 876. Because there are lots of little kinks and dots that are not labeled and so on. So the fourth one, bad habit, is to leave your default settings and let it fester. So here's a perfect example of that. I think everyone knows what software this is made out of. But the one with the thick lines and the shadows and the really amazing rainbow of colors. And then you can also see things like, the year labels are truncated because it's choosing much finer than it needs to be. So you have 3 2000s and 3 2001s and so on, and so on and so forth. And it's almost always a bad idea. The automated software never seems to be able to do what the human beings want it to do. So a lot of my time, or if you talk to anybody who does data visualization for a living, post-processing is like a very important thing. You never pull something out of like an Excel or Tableau or any other software and then just put it out there, because if you are professional about your chart, you're going to have a lot of requirements as to exactly where you want to place your text, your axes, your tick marks, and there are all kinds of things that you need to change, and you can't do it if you let the default settings sit. Okay, next one. Next one is if you assume that if the software makes a chart form, it will be acceptable. So every software gives you a whole gallery of chart forms to pick from. But a lot of the times, there are things that you should never use. So here are two. So that one at the top right is a 3D area chart that you can make on any Excel. The bottom left, I'm not quite sure. This has become very popular, but all I can see here is somebody wants to give me a color blind test. And you see a lot of these things out there. I mean, I think people have been inspired by the colorblind test and just wants to deliver it to more people. This one is particularly crazy because not only are those like bubbles, but they're actually pie charts, each one of them. And as you can tell, this is actually somebody who sells software that makes this. And what my point is, even if you can make it, doesn't mean that you have to. The flip side of this is if your software doesn't make a particular chart form, you're going to assume that it's not something that you should do. So a lot of you like this one. So which software can make this automatically? No software can make this automatically. But the issue is, if you don't get constrained by your software, then you can think more expensively, and you can actually come up with things that are more appealing. And it might take you a little bit longer to get the tools to do it, but it's more rewarding. Seventh bad habit is to serve raw data. So, I mean, I do like sushi, but usually serving raw meat is not that great. Serving raw data is also not that great. So here is a chart that it comes from a really great blog post. I love what the guy did. He is trying to test the theory of the long tail e-commerce. So if you recall, maybe 10 years ago, when Amazon was still a relatively young thing, we were told that the whole Amazon model is to focus on the long tail. And so, instead of the brick and mortars that have a shelf space issue, so you can only give shelf space to the gorillas of the products, Amazon is able to make a lot of money on the long tail. So this guy is saying, well, 10 years later, if Amazon is that great and is helping all the people in the long tail, then shouldn't the long tail kind of disappear? Or shouldn't it even out somewhat? So he also then went and gathered a bunch of data, and I forgot from what site, but from some e-commerce site. And so the raw data is actually what you see here. It's the billions of dollars of music income that are attributed in the blue to the top 1% producers, and the remainder will be the bottom 99% would be in the gray. So the actual data is what's being plotted. This is raw data. Now, but in reality, the story that he's trying to tell is not in the absolute dollars, it's in the proportions, it's in the market share. So on the far right, where he says 77% of revenues and 23% of revenues, that's where the real information is. Now, of course, it's almost impossible for us to read this chart because then you have to go back to every column and then figure out, has the 77 to 23 ratio change as these columns kind of change in size. So this chart can be made much better by not plotting the raw data, but plotting the market share data over time. And you'll find that this is almost always true. It's like the instinct of grabbing that data, whether you scraped it or whatever it is, you grabbed it and then you dump it into Excel and then you just say insert chart and then a chart shows up. That's sort of causing a lot of bad work out there because you really do have to think about what your question is, what is the right way of computing your data so that it actually answers that particular question, as opposed to, this one kind of tangentially answers it, right? I mean, you could do a lot of work to pull that information out, but you really don't want to make your readers work. Okay, the eighth bad habit is to succumb to something that I call loss aversion. So it's kind of like, when I tell people to take data out of a chart, people think I killed their dog. I mean, it's very hard. I don't know. I mean, there's something about data. It's like if I tell you to drop something, people feel really hurt by it, and then people refuse to, and they invent stories to tell me why they shouldn't drop it. It's kind of like, oh, my my ex-girlfriend took that puppy, and it's in Japan now, and I know that puppy loves this shade of pink. And if you're going to make me take that line away, the puppy will never come back to me. It's like a very, very weird thing. So here's an example of something. Like this is the Arctic chart. All I've done is to uncoil it, right? So what's the point of, rolling it up like it's a fruit roll? So you pull it back out, and you have 12 lines. But what I showed you before actually only have 4 lines, right? It's the one on the right. So in my view, the one on the right gives you all of what you need to know, and it's a lot easier to read. But if I ask people to do this, probably not half, 75% of the time, really people think I killed their dog because they want all of the lines there. I don't know why. So if you actually, come out of here tonight, you remember next time you find that your chart is not giving a clear message, think about editing yourself. This is really a whole thing about editing and cutting out the things that are not necessary to communicate that message that you're trying to convey. The 9th bad habit is to print off your data. So you kind of oftentimes see charts like this. So this is in The Economist. There are only 4 countries here. There are 6 countries that cut off the right side. But basically, they are trying to show e-book market becoming dominant in different countries. So the orange stuff is the e-book market in 2 different years, and the red stuff it's the printed book market in 2 different years. But the important feature of this is that the entire data set is printed onto the page, right? So every single number that it's trying to visualize is already on the page. Well, in addition to that, if you think about from a reader's perspective, if you want to get anything out of this page, I guarantee that you'll look at the numbers, not at the quadrants. So that's basically what's wrong with something like this, which is that essentially when all of your data is printed on the page, it is actually a symptom of something wrong with your design. Because it usually is not that the designer wants to do this, it's the designer actually realizes that if the data is not on there, you cannot get anything out of the page. So if I deleted all of the numbers, nobody can really tell what's going on this page. And you'll notice that this problem exists a lot with anyone making like bubble charts or pie charts. So almost every bubble chart and pie chart will always contain the entire data set. Like it's all printed out. And the reason why that is happening is that if you start hiding that information, you'll find that the reader cannot get any information out. Like it's very hard to judge the relative sizes of circles. It's also very hard to judge the relative sizes of slices, especially with many slices. So in order to aid the reader, you're actually printing the data next to it. But the problem is when you do that, then you're admitting the fact that all of your visual elements doesn't actually do any work. And you're asking the readers to just read the numbers. So don't print all of your data. This is a redone version of the same chart with all 6 countries on there. And I just want to show this because on this chart, you can immediately see what the trends are. And I have not printed any of the data, raw data on this page, but it makes for a much clearer chart. So next is the fear of the familiar. So this sounds like really, really weird, right? It's like usually familiar things are not scary, right? Familiar things brings us comfort. We like to be familiar. We don't want to be thrown into a foreign country where we don't speak the language, or we don't want to be shown, new things that we don't know how to operate. But there's something in our dataviz field where we turn this upside down. There's a whole host of people out there who tells you the familiar is boring. I don't want to see any more bar charts or column charts or dot plots or scalar plots or whatever. Those things are done to death. We need something new. Well, it's a very odd thing, because what happens is, you think from the reader's perspective, something new creates this sort of unfamiliarity. It alienates people. In fact, a lot of very new charts requires a very long time for people to learn. Like, first they need to unlearn something that, that's in their head. Then they need to learn the new thing. So for me, I always have a very high bar for novelty. Like, it's not that I won't do it, but there has got to be a pretty strong justification for why I want to expend the energy. Especially in something like a business setting or something like that, you really have to figure out, do I have any political capital to fight this battle with my boss? Like, your boss is probably the one who tells you, why can't you just use the thing that we used before? Which, if there are probably many things wrong with it. So then you're left with, okay, either going with what is familiar or trying to educate lots of people about this new thing that you're going to do, and I think a lot of the times the fight is not worth it. So it's not that you shouldn't do it, but I don't think you should fear something just because it's common. So I guess this is an example of that, right? So the left side, probably the reason why the thing is called up is that the designer thinks that the thing on the left side is really boring. It's just like another line chart showing a time series. Like, why can't we make it more, jazz it up and make it more sexy? So the last bad habit that I've noticed is people keep a stiff upper lip. So given that data visualization is about communications, I like people to speak directly. A lot of designers somehow are trying to play a game with the readers and, are thinking that the readers should figure this out themselves. It's all in the chart. Basically you speak very softly and you really don't spell out what your message is. I don't actually like that. I think that if you leave it to the reader, I would say there's very high likelihood that the reader doesn't get what you're trying to portray, or even worse, get the wrong message. A sort of one specific area in which this often happens is in the chart titles, right? So here's an example. So this data has some very important messages, right? So institutional, which is the orange, is plunging. It seems like people are taking money out. Hedge funds is also falling, but not as steep a rate. But what does the chart title say? YTD cum flows by client type, $1 billion. Well, why couldn't it say huge outflow of institutional funds in recent quarter or something? So, especially when you have the message that's so strong, I think that you need to just spell it out as opposed to, hiding your message. So those are, 11 things that I see recurring, and I hope that in the next however many years that I'm doing my blog, I don't have to come back and talk about these things again. I also hope that some of this will actually help you with your work in terms of, getting more people to understand your message. I think ultimately the goal of all of this is to try to make sure that when you put something out there, the readers are getting what you want to say. Now, I want to just say a few words about blogging. I sometimes get inquiries about people wanting to start a blog and so on and so forth. So I think the most important message I can give you is that if you blog, they won't come. So the point is, it's like the internet is such a huge space that it is very hard when you're starting out to get attention. So the main thing is you have to realize that you're not going to just get attention because you put up a few posts. So you kind of have to have a strategy of figuring out how you're going to grow your blog, how you're going to find some readers, because if you don't do any of that, it's very difficult to get noticed. And if you don't have any readers, it's not really that fun. I mean, unless you just want to practice writing, I mean, it will feel like you're speaking to a black hole. So then after you find your readership, then a different problem shows up, which is the problem that I'm facing. It's the gift that keeps on giving. So it's like every week, including this week, I mean, recently, if you've been a reader, I've been very infrequent in blogging, which is very concerning because I'm kind of already on a stairmaster, and I need to keep blogging, putting up stuff out there. Otherwise, the readership is gone because you don't have any new things for people to read, especially for your most loyal readers who are constantly coming back. You kind of need to give them new stuff because they've already read all of your other stuff. So, be very aware of that. Like once you have a readership, then you have a different problem, especially if you're not making revenues off your blog. And then I have to find other sources of revenues to pay my rent, then it's kind of a struggle. Sadly, a number of important blogs have stopped publishing in the dataviz area in the last year. I hope that they're only taking a temporary hiatus, but we'll see what happens. The other thing interesting is this sort of the issue of status. So if you want to build status using a blog, then I would say think twice about it, because at least until this day, blogging doesn't have the same status as somebody who published a book or something like that, or a paper in a journal. So, it is well established in the academic and the research world, where if you used, let's say, a book or a paper as research for your own work, that you would actually reference it, put it in the bibliography, and things of that sort. I have to say, nothing of this type actually exists in the blogging world. I think that a lot of researchers who use blogs for their research will not reference blogs. So there's a whole status thing that maybe over time this will be overcome, but at the moment, it certainly does not have the same stature. The other thing which is very nice about blogging is the community. So, I put some stuff up there and people will respond to it right away. If they don't like what I say, I would know it right away. If I have a typo, in fact, it will be all over Twitter in like 2 seconds, which happened to me the other day because I spelled shark with a T, and they're like, the best part of the post is the shat attack. It's all over Twitter. So, but the thing is, like, you do get quick feedback from people, and you can test some ideas, and if it doesn't, and then you can learn from some of the readers because you feel like, okay, they actually have a point. And then the last thing is there are actually quite a lot of technical challenges that you have to deal with, despite the fact that they're automated software, but automation can only get you so far. Like for instance, one thing that always annoys me is the fact that a typepad is supposed to have an integration with Twitter, but an integration meaning that every time a post shows up on typepad, basically there's like pinging between these servers so that there will be a Twitter message that will be sent out from my account telling people that I have a new blog. Now, the problem is with a lot of these new technologies, some of these things just don't work. And they're not reliable. It's not that they don't work, they're not reliable. So once in a while, I post it and I don't see a tweet, and then I go in and then I decide that maybe I need to tweet it myself, and then the minute I tweet it, then the other thing comes out. So it's sort of like delays and things of that sort. So it's annoying that sort of way. The other part that is truly annoying is once you picked your name of the blog and the URL, you basically can't change it just because of the whole Google and search engine and the page rank algorithms. Once you change it, you basically have lost of your so-called authority in the past, and it's really hard to build something up from scratch. So you kind of stuck. So there are a whole bunch of these sort of technical challenges that I can talk at length about if people care. So let me kind of summarize by saying, it's been fun, these 10 years of blogging, and I think I have really enjoyed it, and I'm glad that there are people out there who enjoy reading what I have to say about dataviz. I hope that the next 10 years will be ones where, the general literacy level of visualization will go up. I hope that some of you will be inspired to become sort of critics and do more criticism work out there, because we certainly need more of that. There are more charts being done all the time, and there continues to be a need to educate people on best practices and really to combine theory and practice. Here's my contact information, and definitely look up all these other things. I mean, all these logos are things that I'm doing kind of in the real-world education, marrying practice with theory.